Hello, everyone. Welcome to the panel talk on what every product manager delivering AI solutions should know. I now welcome our panelists, Jessie Lamontagne, Data Science Manager, Kinaxis, Anaya Golob, Staff Data Scientist, Shopify, Nahla Salem, Senior Product Manager, Yelp, and Philip Gornicki, Senior Project Manager, Kinaxis. I'll give a brief intro of each of them. Jessie Lamontagne is a data science manager at Kinaxis, where she leads the delivery of a demand forecasting product. Before joining Kinaxis, she built machine learning solutions for credit risk monitoring and developed deep learning algorithms for synthetic data generation. She completed graduate work in economics, during which time she taught statistics, microeconomics, and applied policy. Anaya is a staff data scientist at Shopify, where she brings common sense, wits, and a deep understanding of data. She started her professional life as an astrophysicist and went on to solve data science problems across multiple industries in progressively senior roles. Nahla Salem specializes in product managing B2B machine learning products. She leads a team in Yelp using machine learning to help acquire, engage, and retain Yelp's local businesses. Before Yelp, Nahla built end-to-end ML products in multiple growth stage Toronto startups, where she also built ML and product teams. She has Masters of Business Analytics and an EMBA. Philip Gornicki currently leads the demand forecasting and retail portfolios at Kinaxis. Philip has spent over a decade at the intersection of product management and analytics AI solutions. He has led the development of data-driven products in supply chain, retail, fintech, telecom spaces. I welcome all of you, and we can start our panel discussion.
We know that AI ML has been incorporated into a lot of gadgets and apps that we use all the time. What is your favorite use of AI today in everyday life? And what about it do you wish you had built yourself?
So for me, the one that I think back to is CAPTCHA as a product. It's really simple, sort of the OG CAPTCHA where you have to fill things in. And what I like about it is, I mean, yes, it provides utility to the users, but what I really like about it is sort of the thinking behind it to use it as a data collection mechanism sort of in the background and use that as validation data set. So I think in terms of ML products, I think that's an extremely simple and clever solution with sort of a behind-the-scenes motive in delivering such a product experience. So it's a great fusion between product that adds utility with something that has sort of a some sort of a flywheel effect behind the scenes to be able to continuously improve the experience and again power data science teams to do other things as well. So that's kind of my standout, very simple little utility that I think is really well executed.
How about you, Nahla?
I think I will choose Netflix and the product recommendations. This has been around for years now, but I think it's a good example of machine learning really changing the way an industry works. It has changed the way content consumption happens, I think, in the user experience. And I'm also a fan of Netflix as a product company. Maybe I should say pre-COVID Netflix at this point. But really how they integrate machine learning into their product, I think they were at the forefront of how this should happen.
Last but not least, Anaya?
Maybe more personally, I hate talking on the phone, so my favorite would be the Google Assistant who screens my calls for me and uses text-to-speech to write down things and let me decide whether I want to answer. I wish I built it for money.
Okay. While I'm sure most of the audience is aware of what product management is, there's still varying level of competencies in utilizing product managers in different industries, in different firm size. So Maybe starting with Anaya, describe the role of product manager in an AI ML team.
Ask not the product manager first, that's harsh.
Yep.
So I think, to my mind, a product manager is the bridge between the product market, the people building the product, and sales. Like, they really have to be a jack of all trades, and the better they are at all three, like, if they could do this whole job themselves, that would be the perfect unicorn product manager. Obviously not realistic, but I want them to sell me the product that they think needs to be built and sell the product back to the market once we figure out how to build it.
Nahla?
I think the role of a product manager in an AI or a machine learning product shouldn't be that different from what the role of a product manager should be. So my philosophy is that the business and the product should always come first, and then the technology should come second. So in that sense, my definition of what product management should be is essentially translating product strategy into day-to-day work. That's the short version of the answer, but then that, of course, entails doing a lot of things. So it entails making sure that there is a product strategy and that it's connected to the business strategy, and then breaking that down into a format that the team can consume and repeat it over and over and over again, and then have that drive the roadmap and be part of how the roadmap is prioritized down until the user stories of the day-to-day of machine learning team consumption.
Philip?
Yeah, so from my perspective, I think there's a couple of things where the product manager kind of adds value to the process. I think that the first one would be kind of what Anaya mentioned about being able to synthesize sort of this big, ambiguous market down into something that's a little bit more tangible, a product vision and a product strategy on how to achieve that. Of course, the engineers and the data scientists could do that if they had the time and if they wanted to, but they don't really have the time and don't really want to spend time in escalation, spend time in sort of market and customer discussions. And so that's kind of a lot of context out there that the product manager should ideally be kind of synthesizing to the team, kind of selling everyone on the idea of the direction. The other thing that I think is an important role is sort of the evangelism aspect, especially in AI ML teams. Depending on your organization, sometimes you may feel like you're tucked away to the side working on a small little project, but one of the responsibilities of the product manager should be to sort of evangelize beyond sort of the four virtual walls of that team, what the value added to the overall company is and to the business is. And then the last thing I'd point out is in a ML AI context, I think one important piece of it is also understanding more than just kind of the modeling and the data and the code that's shipped, but everything that surrounds that. So, a successful product is not just a bunch of code that gets used by people. There is a delivery aspect to it. There's customer support implications. There are legal implications, et cetera, et cetera. And it really is incumbent upon the product manager to keep that in mind. So while working with the team, thinking of all these little frankly annoying things, I'll even say that myself, that it takes to actually ship a successful product. So I think those three things to me are where the product manager should be adding value.
Yeah, you speak about adding value, and a few things kind of stood out to me, like being aware of legal things, being aware of data, being aware of algorithms. What are some specific skills that you would say as a product manager you would need to work in AI ML? So do product managers need to code? Do product managers need to be able to query data? Do product managers, how deep do you get in the various pieces of the product lifecycle?
Yeah, so from my perspective, I think it really, really depends on the type of product that you manage first and foremost. So if you're working on something that's a lot more, an internal platform, very infrastructure related, then obviously the level there, your level of understanding of that technology is much more important to your role. On the other side of the spectrum, if you're working on a product that incorporates AI ML as sort of a final kind of customer-facing solution, which is something that I'm personally a little bit more familiar with, I think the threshold is probably a little bit lower. And I always think of it as what's helpful is having an understanding of what I would describe as the table of contents of AI ML. So not necessarily having in-depth research background in all of these areas, but understanding the overall picture of what are the types of models available, what are the kind of the families of models available, having the basics of some hands-on experience, even if it's not super advanced, at least you've kind of gotten your feet wet. So I think that to me is sort of the minimum threshold to be able to have kind of intelligent discussions with your data science teams and be able to, you're not necessarily the expert coming into it from a data science perspective, but you do need to be able to negotiate trade-offs and understand kind of what that team is really working towards under the hood. So that to me, I'd be curious to hear Anea's take on that from a data science perspective, but that to me is sort of the minimum bar of entry if you're going to be working on these products.
Yeah. Nahla, what would you say are AI/ML specific skills that you find PM must have?
I think my answer again will be it is the same skills that make a regular product manager successful. And I think in the industry traditionally, especially when I was getting started, there was a lot of emphasis on communication skills and getting a lot of opinions coordinated together and synthesis, etc. But I think after doing this for years now, I think what I feel is most important is actually being opinionated. I've seen many product managers fail and products fail because of wanting to get consensus and not wanting to take a stand for what you really believe should be the case. And if you do that right, if you do that after you've done your research, after you've listened to different opinions, after you've actively sought people who differ with you, I think your product would be successful. And how that specifically translates to AI/ML is what Philip alluded to, which is sometimes our teams are sort of a bit isolated and they end up being a little bit of back-end teams in some settings. So unless you're really an advocate for your team and you have opinions on where machine learning can contribute and are not waiting for people to tell you what you do, you wouldn't be successful in that role.
Anea, are there skills you wish more product manager had to effectively work with you?
Yeah, like I think for sure you don't need to be as technical as a technical team, but the more you understand, if you've taken basic courses on ML, if you've played with code just to understand what's going on, that's always helpful. I think also having a familiarity with the data that's going into a model, if the model is the product, especially since product managers are more likely to be client-facing, you might get the first complaints when something goes wrong. And if you have some intuition about the data and how to fix that, that's helpful. And I think on the other side, knowing what typical data scientists don't know is also really important, because I think a nice thing about ML is that you can flip between domains, and once you have data in a data frame that you can feed into a model, everything looks the same. So people jump between domains and don't have the expertise, and a lot of times I think PMs can assume that it's not important, that these directives can come from the top down. But I really appreciate getting a strong education in a new field from the PM, who is likely the expert on the market.
Yeah, domain expertise is actually a really good skill for PMs to have. I would agree with that. Okay, pivoting a little bit, we're here for MLOps conference, so a lot of emphasis is on getting product in to clients' hand, getting things out the door, delivering value. Tell me, everyone, what does delivery look like when the product manager and the cross-functional delivery teams are well aligned with each other? What's the best case scenario like?
No surprises. That's all.
Philip? For me, I think Anea touched on it a little bit about the kind of the context, the context piece, and again, this PM playing that role of synthesizing the market and all the ambiguity out there into something that's a little bit more tactical. And to me, a good flow with the delivery team is sort of a constant communication and good interaction between the product management side and all of the engineers and data scientists. So on a almost daily basis, being there to kind of answer any questions, and of course from an org perspective, that requires you to have enough product managers to do so. So like a 1-to-8 ratio or a 1-to-10 ratio is something that's pretty much which is pretty much the sweet spot to be able to have that flow, to be able to have that interaction between every single data scientist on the team and their product manager, to ask them questions, to get context, and I think that's really where the flow begins, because people feel a little bit more attached to the work that they do, and maybe less surprised by the surprises which will inevitably come, unfortunately.
I think seamless would be my short answer. I think this goes back to the point of strategy. I think if you have a strategy that is well advertised between different parts of a company, then you will find that naturally people are working in the same direction, and especially if they take that strategy and sort of consume it into how they divide their work day to day, and then it becomes a lot more of a seamless integration of where we're going. I've been in settings where this wasn't very clear, strategy wasn't very clear, so everyone was sort of coming up with their own ideas and initiatives, so that would obviously have an impact on the product. I've been in settings where there was a sort of an overemphasis on machine learning, if you can imagine that, and there was pressure to sort of highlight it in the product. And what I advocated for was that we should really focus on the user experience and not internally on what we think is important, and just make the user experience seamless without highlighting what technology we're using to do that, because the users don't really care.
So following up on that, for Philip and Nahla, what are some specific methodologies you've employed to kind of anchor those initiatives and get to that successful delivery?
I think maybe I will mention how the teams are structured. So going back to Netflix that I mentioned as an example, what they really did well, which might be sort of common wisdom, but then actually in reality so few companies do that. What they did was they integrated data scientists into product teams. And that meant that data scientists were working along with engineers in a certain product area, focusing on certain problems, building user empathy over time, and working towards business goals in a quarterly, annual basis, etc. So everyone was sort of moving forward. And I think that this is what so many companies don't get right. In many other cases where you have a setup where data scientists are sort of isolated, or because they don't naturally integrate with software engineers, we keep them in separate teams and manage them differently. Yes, they will build great models, but they will not have the best context. The overall user experience might not be the best. And really, innovation is not going to happen as much, because in my opinion, innovation really happens when the product managers provide the context, describe the problem very clearly, and then they leave it up to the teams to innovate on how to solve that problem.
Yeah, I think that's a great point in terms of kind of how the teams work, and also, I always think about the ratios of how these teams are comprised, especially in a data context where you have such specialization between the different parts that need to come together, everything from data engineering all the way to kind of the UX team and the user experience team, and everything in between, the data scientists, the machine learning engineers, et cetera. So I think getting those ratios right, like getting the teams working together and getting those ratios right, is also really important, so that you don't, I know from past experience, sometimes you hit points where there's a single bottleneck there, and the roadmap is being delayed, but there's all this capacity within the team, but it's within kind of certain pockets of that, and that's never good. So maybe evaluating what that right ratio is, and even throwing in things like QA in there. I think that's an important piece to make sure that sort of the train is running along smoothly, and we don't have sort of built-in bottlenecks because we've overinvested in some parts or underinvested in others. So there's got to be kind of a consideration for what that ideal structure looks like.
Thank you. So now we've talked about what it looks like when things go well. Let's talk a little bit about what happens when things don't go so well. So a question for everyone. Have you ever delivered a product that did not get used or did not get used as intended? And what do you think could have been done differently to ensure adoption?
I was going to say we all have, but
Yeah.
Shall I go
Me too.
first? Okay. I think if a product manager told me that they've never delivered something that failed, then they have either not been working as a product manager or they're hiding the fact. So I think honestly, it goes back again to focusing on the wrong things and either not having a strategy or having not having the right strategy, so to say. So if you have something of the, like, maybe I should be more specific about what happened in my case. I think in my case, what ended up happening was we ended up being too fond of the technology, I guess, is a summary of what happened, and lost sight of the user experience and optimizing for the user experience. And this is such a classic mistake. Like saying that now, you know, makes me feel silly, but this, you know, happens all the time.
Yeah, I think for me, you know, same as Nahla said, you know, it happens. It sucks when it happens. It does happen, and you try to learn from it. For me, it also comes down to assumptions, and maybe in the past, assumptions that we maybe took for granted or didn't take enough time to actually validate back to the user. So in my case, I think back to certain features that relied on certain user behavior in sort of an interview context or in a research context that weren't sort of pressed enough. And the result of that is that you have people wanting something or saying that they want something, but when the thing actually gets delivered, their actual observed behavior is not, you know, what they even said it would be. So in my case, that was you know, asking users for additional inputs to provide a better prediction, which, you know, sounds great, but no one actually wants to do the work to provide those additional inputs, and features go unused. So I think it goes back to kind of testing some of those assumptions, and with time sort of learning, and you can't possibly test every single thing under the sun. You'll never have time. That's where sort of your product intuition comes in a little bit, and I think over time you start to identify where you really need to be investing and where do you really have to be you know, a lot more diligent, a lot more suspicious of what you're hearing from users, and dig in a little bit more versus other cases where you're willing to take the risk, where it might not be a big thing to turn the feature around if those assumptions don't pan out. So yeah, I think just measuring those assumptions is where I've gotten caught in the past for sure.
Or maybe doing more MVPs, smaller MVPs, I think.
Right.
Yeah, in cases where I failed for that same reason, except of course it's a bit harder to do with machine learning, but I do think that it can be done.
I think another part of that that could fall under the category of assumptions is that, without getting too specific, I think like in a lot of B2B scenarios where you're selling ML as the product and you are outputting something from a model, the assumption that your customer can describe the problem that they want solved is often unfounded. Like we've had situations where, as a group even, the four of us, like you produce a model and you're giving someone a forecast for something, and without really understanding what they were going to do with it in the first case, you realize this isn't actually what they need to solve their fundamental problem. So really, maybe that's a product market fit question, but just really understanding what the point of what you're delivering is up front.
Yeah, it's funny, Phil's example actually made me think of a very famous product that also requires people to give input. Siri is terrible with accents, right? As a person with an accent, it never understands me, so I gave up. But there is actually an option to calibrate Siri. You can keep giving it input and correct her until she learns that this is what you meant. But the process is very tedious and cumbersome, and no one bothers. So don't feel bad. Apple did it too.
Fair enough, thank you. That makes me feel a little bit better.
Okay, product managers are often the glue that binds product team together, and that's obvious from some of your answers, that you think about the culture, you think about interactions, you think about the full life cycle of the product and how it'll go to market. But the best glue can only do so much if the pieces don't fit well together. So have you been in a situation where the challenge to delivery was actually rooted in team structure? And how did you approach it? For Nahla, maybe first?
So I think I agree with the spirit of product managers being the sort of a glue, but I wouldn't personally describe the role as such myself. You might actually find online an interview with Eric Schmidt, Google, in which he said we started noticing that we were bringing in glue people into Google, and then we took steps to actively stop that because they felt that he's using the word differently, but essentially what he meant was people who are just there to be ferrying information around, and that is not the best use of time. But I think going back to team structures and how we can change those to be, or work around team structures that are not optimal. For example, the situation we have been talking about of having separate machine learning team because the ratio of resources doesn't work. For example, you just can't afford having a data scientist on every product team. One thing that I have done is to apply the concept of mission teams. And that means taking a subset of people from, say, a product development team and a machine learning or a data science team, and then creating a mission team, which is temporary by nature, but you assign them a certain problem and you clarify the boundaries and you leverage the experience of different people with different functional skills, and again allow that interaction to happen that sparks innovation in my opinion. So yeah, short answer is using mission teams to get around not having the optimal team structure.
Anaya, have you been in this situation before?
Yeah, I think so. I think mission teams are the right answer. Like, it comes down to if you have the wrong ratio between engineers, platform people, whatever you need to get something done, if you don't have the people to build the things in the right order, you can be just completely stuck.
Yeah, agreed 100%. I think it comes down to the right team, the right ratios, and making sure that those teams are enabled to do their own work without too much reliance on others just to do kind of the run-of-the-mill tasks. There's always dependencies, but most of the time you should not always be running into dependencies. So the team composition should be enough to deliver something in the right ratios and kind of keep the train moving.
And as product manager, how do you influence leadership into delivering those ratios that actually enable you to get the product out?
I think it's challenging in any case because then you get into headcounts and you get into budgeting and things being frozen or unfrozen or departures. So that's the reality. Anyone who works anywhere will kind of deal with that. So I think the best thing to do is maybe just to highlight what be as constructive about it as possible and highlight kind of what the ideal ratios are. Maybe highlight instances where those ratios are applied and look how well it's going. But beyond that, I think those are just kind of the people or the human challenges that we run into working with other people or humans.
I think I would, or in the past, I employ the same user empathy skills that we do with our external customers internally. So leaders in organizations should or hopefully want you to tell them what you need, but they want you to tell them in a way that impacts results and how that affects their own metrics and their own business goals. I think where I've seen PMs get that wrong in the past is if you sort of go and start talking about your product and user experience and how great those two things are, whereas really what you want to do is to say, hey, Mr. Executive, your goal for this year or next year is so and so, and this is how I'm going to help you, and this is my assessment of the opportunity, the sizing, or the revenue goals, whatever this executive cares about. So I've definitely employed that in the past to make business cases to move resources around or get resources in different areas.
Continuing on the theme of strategies and best practice, do you have some cornerstone kind of strategies that you've employed that might be surprising to people that have worked well for you?
In terms of team composition?
In terms of product, like in terms of managing a product, do you have specific kind of strategies you've relied on that are maybe not obvious to people that are new in the field, but you've developed over years and experience?
I don't know that it's particularly unique, but in the context of an ML or AI product, and Nahla alluded to this as well, I think the most important thing is just dropping AI and ML out of the conversation until much, much later and understanding what it is that wants to be solved. And AI ML should frankly be the last resort, not the first resort. If you can solve it in a much simpler way, then by all means do that. So that might be maybe counterintuitive to some, especially kind of in an ML context where, as the cliche goes, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and you try to squeeze ML into every possible corner because you are the ML team and you feel obliged to do that. Maybe one counterintuitive thing would be to completely drop that out of your vocabulary and just think of ways to solve it. And if it happens to need or benefit from AI ML, then by all means, but don't maybe start there. So from a strategy perspective or from how to approach building product, that might be a somewhat counterintuitive thing for some that are immersed in the space.
I think for me, that would be just how I was describing now, that technical teams tend to naturally come together and organize themselves around functional skills. I think also product managers sometimes tend to come together around features and deliveries and dependencies and spend so much time talking about these things, whereas I think as a rule of thumb that might not be very intuitive, the less you do that, the more successful you are. And by that I mean the more the internal PM conversation is quote-unquote CEO level, the more successful the company is going to be. Because you sort of leave the coordination for the engineering managers or the technical program managers and just spend all of your time together talking about the strategy and how it's applied and the user problems that you have faced and how ideas can go around between your different teams. So it's a sort of an ideal scenario and never happens at a level that is 100% just because we live in the real world in which there are commitments, etc. But the more CEO level conversations between PMs, the more successful the company, in my opinion.
It's a really interesting perspective, actually. How specifically do you manage the whole pipeline of a product? Like, walk us through from, say, some of you have mentioned, framing the business problem and exploring the best solution, and then having maybe analysts and data scientists look at potential way to solve, all the way to productization. How do you manage these transitions between different teams and different groups when you're building a product?
One thing that I've used in the past that has been really, really helpful has been when you think of a product roadmap, you think of the things that you're going to build, but also actively managing and evangelizing a discovery roadmap. And that discovery roadmap could be a bunch of things. It could be things on the user experience side where you want to test out certain kind of user behavior and assumptions, or it could be very data science related if you have a hypothesis that you can do something in a certain way, but you're not sure. So I've had a lot of success in that and making that public to say, here's our what we're building and here's what we're experimenting. And those two things are sort of running in parallel, and everyone sort of has visibility into what's being experimented on. It's not like people you don't wonder what people are spending their time on because you have it there in front of you, and that sort of also builds a culture of curiosity within people and kind of hypothesis testing of if you put out there, hey, here are the 5 things that we're experimenting or trying to answer this quarter that will inform how we build this thing in the future. I think people really appreciate that storytelling. So that to me is how to involve sort of data science teams or other teams that product managers work with early on in the process and have them also kind of part owners of that discovery roadmap and get excited about discovering something, communicating what they've tested, what worked, what didn't work, and then making recommendations on how to proceed and how to build it. So that to me is a good way to kind of bridge the gap between these high-level ideas and actual tactical implementations.
Thank you. How about you, Nahla?
I love the idea of the discovery roadmap, but I think where I will go with my answer to Jessie's question of managing the flow of information between different teams is I don't, or at least I try not to. So what I try to do is to really empower the teams and to train them to be able to manage that flow on their own as much as possible, and then sort of take a step back from that information flow and execution and be more involved on the strategy, ideation, problem space. And in the past, that also is something that doesn't come naturally to teams. So in the past, I've been involved at some stage, shown people a good way to do this sort of information flow, and then empowered them to keep doing it on their own, and sort of took a step back. And I found that people like to grow into doing things that they haven't done before, especially if this is a safe space in which mistakes are accepted as something that's going to happen, and someone takes the time to provide a better way of doing things.
Sorry, Anaya, more questions for Nahla and Philip coming. Customers often look for the newest thing, and they want like the trendy product. They want deep learning, or they want whatever they've read about in some business magazine. How do you incorporate trends into product without kind of falling for the trendy? Maybe Nahla first this time.
I think it's what Philip said, by just delaying the conversation about technology to the latest point possible. And it also, what I mentioned before, of actively setting the expectations of stakeholders that the technology is not the focus, and the business problems are the focus, the user problems are the focus. So it's definitely something that I have done in the past, in which I guess I have undersold artificial intelligence or machine learning, and just by, I think, getting the focus right and controlling the conversations in the right direction. I've been in situations where you do that, you focus on the problem, people are aligned on the problem, and then you start out by maybe a simpler technology, and then the technology evolves. So it evolves from heuristics maybe to a model, and then maybe to neural networks. So yeah, by focusing on the right conversations and delaying the technology conversation.
Yeah, and I think, to me, the first line of defense is the marketing, or the product marketing as well. So many of these new trends are just kind of the same trend that's kind of rebranded. You go from, what was it? It was data mining, then big data analytics, then that ML. You kind of refer to something that does evolve, but it's not kind of a big step change in how things are done. And chances are you're already evolving to it. So the fastest and easiest thing to do that doesn't require any or minimal work is just kind of reframing how you speak about it, to show that you're sort of, especially in an enterprise context, if you're selling, you want it known that you're sort of adopting the latest technology. So there's a very quick branding exercise there, just to kind of change how you speak about the thing that has changed names, but it's fundamentally the same thing as before. So that, I think, is sort of the easiest and simplest thing to do. And then the fact is that there's especially in an enterprise or B2B, there's this dynamic where you're working with a buyer persona, which is not the same as your user persona, and that buyer may not know exactly what they're talking about when it comes to the details of it, and that marketing does play a role to kind of get people into the door and kind of get them excited and talking to you and interested in your product. But ultimately, when it comes to sustained value over time, it's what Nahla mentioned earlier of it just delivering value to the end user, agnostic to the type of technology that you're using. So I think at most, this technology, it gets you, a foot in the door. But after that, once things get used, that's when the pragmatic aspect of this comes into play, where you've got to deliver on a certain value, a certain end goal, regardless of the technology that you're using.
On the opposite side of this, Anaya, you might know about new trends and innovation that are happening in the data science sphere before any customer hears about them. Are there been times where you felt it was your duty to kind of influence the product manager into incorporating something in the product that they had never thought about?
I think no. I think it depends if ML is the product or if ML is the back of the product. If ML is the product and there's going to be some market trend where everyone is going to be demanding some model is supported. I really hope that the PM knows that market and is aware of it at the same time. On the other side, if you are doing something with ML in the background, I would hope that the PM doesn't care as much about the specific backing technology. And if something comes up that's going to do a better job, I hope that we have defined the interfaces between the model and whatever we're surfacing such that we can plug and play different models under the hood and hopefully run some experiments, maybe get some multi-armed bandits in there and just do the work to figure out what works better. And if it doesn't work better, write a blog post that gets us some press saying something cool about it.
Write a blog post as a last resort is always good. Yeah. I tried this and you did nothing. Okay, we're almost at time. So for everyone, as a last kind of round, if there's anything you want people to take away from this panel in a sentence or less.
I have slightly more than a sentence. Well, if I were to summarize it in one sentence, it would be no one cares about AI and ML in your product. That would be my sentence.
Shots fired.
Very controversial, I know. But in most cases, unless we're dealing with a specific case where ML is the product, in the cases where ML is an enabler to the product, which is the vast majority of products out there, what matters is sort of the outcomes that you're providing. And thinking of it ML first will make sure that you're squeezing ML where it doesn't belong. So that's what I would say as the one takeaway is be a counterbalance and make sure you're critically assessing where to put your ML capabilities and invest your time, what types of use cases versus other ones that could be solved much more simply. That's my run-on sentence.
I think mine would be focus more on the strategy and less on the technology. So you should pay attention to both, but the focus should definitely be more on strategy.
Anaya, final last words?
Since presumably people here are on the ML side, I think interrogate your PMs and get an understanding of the market you're working in. Domain knowledge matters.
Yeah, the original title of this panel was The PM Should Know. And I think that's what I want to leave people with as well, is if you don't know what to build, the PM should know. Talk to them.
Cool.
I think we're at time for questions.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much for the talk. It was really insightful. So my question is for Michael. You mentioned about a public discovery roadmap. And the personal challenge I've had doing something like that is often the result of one experiment is going to determine what follow-up experiments I have. So how can I have that public for 5 or 6 weeks down the line when I'll have no clue what experiment I'll be doing 5 or 6 weeks down the line?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe it depends on the, maybe you want to think of it less as one specific experiment, but more of kind of a broader question that you're going to solve, like how do I better give people insights into so-and-so, or how do I let them accomplish a thing, which is probably a series of insights. So I think if you try to expose kind of the nitty-gritty of every single hypothesis you want to test, that may be a little bit ineffective to communicate, but if you want to, maybe if you bubble it up to a higher level and say, we want to change the way people interact with X and we have these ideas about it, that might be a little bit more effective, so that you can kind of, all of those things that you mentioned, one experiment impacting the next one and the next one, that's sort of a detail that you care about, and you don't need to articulate that from the get-go to everyone. You can tell that when you're done, kind of walk everyone through what you went through, but maybe from the get-go, maybe if you focused on the higher question that you're trying to solve, that might be more effective of a communication tool.
Actually, I have 2 questions. The first one is about the example you gave, Nahla, on Netflix. You said that it was very smart to include data scientists in the strategy. My question is, how do you manage their workload? Because if they get interrupted with so many meetings, strategy meetings, they don't have time to develop, and that can be a huge bottleneck in the life cycle of the project. So that's the first question. And the second one is, I agree with the fact that the business comes first, but you need to keep the tech profiles motivated. So how do you find the trade-off to do that?
So I think you're right in that one of the most important skills that a PM should have is time management. And usually, I think the pitfall that a lot of people have is that when everything is a priority, then nothing is. And who I will quote here is Steve Jobs. So he said that focus is saying no to 1,000 good ideas. And this is what I have found that people in general find very hard to do. So it is offending people by saying, I'm not going to attend this meeting because there's no agenda, or because my input is not needed, or because the cadence is too much, which I've definitely done in the past. So I think it's less about dedicating time to important things and more about taking time away from the things that matter less rather than the things that don't matter. Because you would naturally not spend time on things that don't matter, but it's this taking, and this also goes back to what I meant by being opinionated in what really matters and just sticking to what you think would make a bigger impact. And I don't think I caught the next question. Sorry.
It was a little bit echoey and hard to hear, so we may have missed.
Yeah, sorry. The second question was, I understand and I agree that business should always come first and technology just a mean, but the people you are working with like the technology and really want to try the latest blog post that just came. So how do you find the trade-off to keep them motivated and still make them like their job?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it's not the PM's responsibility to micromanage sort of at that level of what people are. There's a really important kind of experimentation need that teams have, and it's by no means kind of the PM's expectation or right to say no to those things. I think there needs to be time. I'd be curious to hear on the data science side, there needs to be time for the team to kind of immerse themselves in that and play around. But when it comes to the actual product roadmap and delivery of things, I think that's where it needs to be a little bit more pragmatic and ready to add value. But it by no means that people shouldn't be playing around with the latest and greatest on their own. That's how I would see it.
Yeah, I think if you have the ratios right on that team and you have enough people building the infrastructure and building these models specifically, people should have the time to run those experiments on the side and not get in trouble, I hope.
Okay, I think one last question.
First, thank you very much for your insights. In our team, our data scientists are pretty empowered in the sense that they act like mini project managers. So we can pitch our own epics, write them, do the stakeholder management from that perspective. And I want to know, what is your take on that? Do you think it's a good idea that even the machine learning engineers, data scientists have the confidence and the skills to themselves? Or do you rather think it should only the product manager to do the stakeholder management and data scientists should do what they love and supposed to be hired for, build models, what else?
I mean, I would say, I think, I have no idea what a data scientist is. It means something different anywhere you go. And in a lot of places, doing the market analytics to figure out what is needed, what there is demand for, what could be useful, is part of the job. And I think that's absolutely critical. And then as you scale things up, you need to get the professionals involved. But having people working in data empowered to figure out those things is amazing and desirable.
I mean, I can complement the answer. I think if what I understood your question was, is it okay for data scientists to be writing their own user stories? And I've been in setups where it was exclusively the PMs and setups where it was shared or primarily even on the technical team side. And I think it depends on the culture. So you can't parachute into a culture that is one of the two and do something different. I think if the team is mature enough to be able to translate the roadmaps and the epics to user stories themselves, if you do the training or the culture in the company is to give people the autonomy to do that on their own, then I would definitely say that it would be a good use of time.
Thank you. Let's thank the panelists. Thanks, Jessie, Nahla, Philip, and Anaya for your valuable time and good insights. And thank you, audience, for attending and listening in.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.